Hi guys. So this section is going to walk you through 4 poems that are kind of illustrative of the ideas of voice and word choice and syntax and speaker. And there's really a million poems I could have chosen for you guys for this, but I feel like these are really significant poems which kind of speak to these ideas. So I'm going to walk you through them as quickly as I can. I'm not going to hit everything. There's so much that you can say about all of these poems when it comes to literary analysis that I can't physically discuss everything. But I really want to speak here mainly to the ideas of voice and syntax and situation. So the first is Nero by Langston Hughes, and this is a poem written in, I believe, 1922. Langston Hughes, if you don't know, was an extremely famous writer of the Harlem Renaissance, and he was sort of representative of the movement. He was representative of black culture being appropriated by whites during the Harlem Renaissance, which happened for the first time, really. There was appreciation of black music, jazz, art, literature, culture, and he wrote about it in the positionality that it was very problematic because a lot of white culture was appropriating his culture, black culture, and he kind of fought back against that idea. And so Langston Hughes, he writes here in several stanzas, about 6 stanzas, and I want you to notice the speaker here. So it's a first-person speaker, it's the first-person narrator. He says, I am a Nero. Immediately off the bat, he has an identity set forth. And he describes what I personally am, but he also describes I as in the collective identity and unity of this culture. And so he says, I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. So he's here working in free verse. You'll see there's no end rhyme. And he's using similes to describe the color of his skin. So he's talking about the physical appearance here. And he's self-identifying based on skin color here because that is what he's seen as by the outside culture. So he is talking to some type of audience, and it's up to us to identify what the audience is. We don't know if it's contemporaries of his. We don't know if it's people living in Harlem. We don't know if it's white culture. That is kind of up for interpretation. But as we go on, we can see that the tone is changing. So he says, I've been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I brushed the boots of Washington. Now, this imagery of Washington that he's evoking is symbolic. And it's representing this idea, not just of Washington, but of actual ideas of American identity and freedom and equality. And he's very intelligently and very smartly saying that he's subservient to the idea of freedom because he is at the level of the boots of Washington. He's not allowed in the doorsteps. He's the slave. He's the keeper. He's the one who is downtrodden and oppressed. That's the imagery that we're getting by the allusions to these famous figures of Caesar and Washington. He says, I've been a worker. Under my hand the pyramids arose. Pretty clear imagery. I've made a mortar for the Woolworth building. So we get the idea that his culture not only are people who have been oppressed, but they've also created. So they care for and they create what white culture essentially enjoys. And he says all of this in very colloquial language. So Langston Hughes wrote in very sort of straightforward, common speak. It was purposefully accessible. It was purposefully language of the era and of the time. And in a lot of his poetry, he pulls in sort of the beat and rhythm of jazz as well, and R&B to kind of bring in that idea of that music into his poetry. So notice how he's speaking to his audience, his positionality as speaker. He says, I've been a singer all the way from Africa to Georgia, Georgia the deep south. I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime. So we see the transformation from slave to someone who is producing a culture that is producing an idea, a type of music that is being enjoyed and appropriated by the same white culture. And he's saying, I not only have gone from cleaning and building, I carried and I create, I made. Note the verbiage that's being used here. He says, I've been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo. They lynched me still in Mississippi. So we're going all the way from slave trade up through current state, 1926, I'm sorry, lynchings that are happening in the United States. So we still don't have equality for this culture. He's saying, but we create, we build, we do, and then you take, and then you kill us. So you get the feeling that he's speaking more and more to a white culture that is oppressing the black culture here. And he says, I am a Negro. We get the refrain, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. And note that he says, my Africa. It's a way of kind of reappropriating that culture and that stance as an African-American author here. I then had you read Suicide Note by, hang on one second, I'm trying to find the right thing. A Suicide Note by Janice Mirikitani. She is a third-generation Japanese-American writer, and she was an activist. She was in an internment camp along with her parents during World War II, and she basically fought for Asian American rights. But here, this poem is very interesting because it talks about cultural conflict. She did survive abuse from family members, and a lot of that is in her poetry. And so she gives us a juxtaposition and exposition at the beginning where she says that an Asian American student was found to have jumped to her death due to an apology for having received less than perfect grade point average. So note the structure of the poem. That's why I've pulled this one up here, because the structure of the poem is very unique. You see these repeated refrains where you kind of get the mental repetition, and you get this sort of beat that occurs where you kind of feel this oppressive drum-like energy. So the speaker again, we start from the outside where it says, how many notes written, ink smeared like bird prints in the snow. This is a unique formatting of language. Again, the word choice is very significant. It's poetic. It's kind of open-ended, and we have no idea when we're starting to read this what it's talking about. And we immediately go into a first-person narrator who we start with this refrain, not good enough, not pretty enough, not smart enough. And you see that refrain takes up the most space on the page, and it's spread out because we see this thought over and over again, and it's kind of the most visually significant point on the page. You see how it's indented? That's purposely done because she's playing with structure to emphasize this idea that it is ever present in this poor narrator's mind. And we know here that the narrator is supposed to be probably a girl, based on this beginning, but as we start diving deep in, we see that language kind of tell us her gender, her situation, and who she's speaking to. So she says, Dear Mother and Father, we have a very clear audience. I apologize for disappointing you. I've worked hard, not good enough. Harder, perhaps, to please you. So you see, this is where we have the conscious of the narrator, and then we have sort of the subconscious of the language from her parents that has been beat into her over and over and over again. And you see how they're separated. They're not one. So you see this constant struggle, this literal strain and struggle between the two. There's a gap here. And And so it's really significant. She says, harder perhaps to please you. It's just, if only I were a sun, shoulders broad as the sunset threading through the pines. This beautiful imagery and language, this similes that are used. She says, I would see the light in my mother's eyes, or the golden pride reflected in my father's dreams. Remember, we talked about these sort of abstract ideas. The word choices here are, again, abstract: light, pride, gold. These are prized elements that we want to seek and have. My father's dreams of my wide male hands worthy of work and comfort. She says, I would swagger through life muscled and bold and assured. And notice that we had this kind of repetition. Again, free verse, but we have this repeated sort of beat that's being used. I would swagger through life, muscle and bold and assured, drawing praises to me like currents in the bed of wind, virile with confidence. So you see this sort of building up of what she would be, and then it's immediately destroyed by those thoughts that come back through. Not good enough, not strong enough, not good enough. So you see the battle between the two consciousness here. I apologize, tasks do not come easily, each failure a glacier. So we have this metaphor, this sort of overwhelming disappointment. Disapproval, a footprint, each disappointment ice above my river. So I have worked hard. So again, these beautiful images and metaphors that are being used here. And throughout, you'll see this continuation of not good enough, not strong enough, not smart enough. It's the most visually significant portion, and you see that because it's constant weight on the narrator. So she talks about her sacrifice, bone by bone. She's perched on the ledge of my womanhood, fragile as wings. Again, we have this metaphor of her bird-like, ready to take flight. And that idea of flight, of course, is freedom and sort of encompassing her own identity, and she doesn't get to do this. So we have really interesting gender dynamics discussed in here. We have cultural readings that we can do of it. And she says, it's snowing, steadily, not good weather for flying. The sparrows sillied and dizzied by the wind on the edge. So we now start to realize the setup of sort of the narrative that's happening. She's on the edge. She's the bird, of course. She's symbolized by this bird, this idea of freedom, but she's a young bird. She's not ready. And she says, I make this ledge my altar. So we have this religious metaphor happening here to offer penance. This air will not hold me. The snow burns my crippled wings. So she's saying, I can't survive. And she's this beautiful language. The tears drop like bitter cloth softly into the gutter below. And then we have this language again, not good enough, not strong enough, not smart enough. Choices thin as shaved ice. So again, these similes. Notes shredded, drift like snow. On my broken body covers me like whispers of sorries, sorries. So also notice that we don't have complete sentences here. We get this sort of fragmented language because we get the feeling that this girl in her suicide note, it's extremely emotional. And you get the feeling that she wasn't really allowed to be emotional. So she says, perhaps when they find me, they'll bury my bird bones beneath the sturdy pine and scatter my feathers like an unspoken song of this white and cold and silent breast of earth. So these beautiful poetry, again, not sort of what you think of when you think of classic poetry. And I'm going to do two more. So Fire and Ice by Robert Frost is a very famous poem where he says, essentially he sets up a juxtaposition or a dichotomy, and he says, some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. So we get this sort of idea of impulse and pleasure. And the idea of fire here is representative of sort of watching the world burn. He says, but if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. So we get this very ironic tone where he's very clipped and very glib with the audience. Also note that the end rhyme here is very important. Fire, ice, desire, fire, twice. And the imagery that we're using with fire and ice, the juxtaposition between the two, both are sort of harsh elements, but they're juxtaposed here as a type of ending that's completely different. And lastly, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time by Robert Herrick. So Robert Herrick was a writer during the early modern period. He wrote in the pastoral, and a lot of the pastoral poetry was carpe diem poetry. So it urged the idea of seizing the day while you're alive. Now, at the time, you have a very proper sense of what it is to be a lady and what it is to be a gentleman. And a lady, of course, is a virgin. And there's a lot of cheeky poetry which kind of undermined this idea. And Herrick's To the Virgins to Make Much of Time fits along with that sort of cheeky tone. And he has 4 stanzas, and he says it's a very clear rhyme scheme. He says, "Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and the same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying." So this idea of the flower, life represented, of course, by the blooming of the flower, and death, of course, represented by the dying of the flower. So this idea of seasonality, birth, and death, and sort of the cyclical journey of nature is all very important in this poem. And he says, "The glorious lamp of heaven, the sun," and sun here can be both the physical sun and the metaphorical religious sun. The higher he's getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. So sun is personified here, and we get the idea that life and death come and go with the rising and setting of the sun. And it says, "The age is best which is at first, when youth and blood are warmer. So when you're young, but being spent the worst and worst, times still succeed the former." So he's saying life is better when you're young. Even the bad times when you're young are better than the later years. It says, "Then be not coy." So he's talking here, he's a speaker, he's talking to his audience of young virgins. "Then be not coy, but use your time, and while ye may, go marry." So marry here is a double meaning. So marry as in be merry, because you get the sound of the idea of marry, but you also get the idea of marriage. It says, "For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry." So it is this kind of ironic warning that if you wait too long to go do this, to go be merry and go be married and enjoy all of the pleasures that come with that, then you will be too old and you will be basically wasted and lost in your old age. So those are 4 poems that I hope kind of give you an understanding of how to evaluate voice, syntax, word choice.